Thomas, are you there? Yeah,
Yes,
you have the top priority to speak first.
Well, lots of interesting points that were made about my proposal, but there is one that I have missed and which I think is the most important one. I think Michael especially quite nicely summarized the idea that for me consciousness is a drive or attention, but then when he was speaking about the difference between an amoeba and the human brain, then he immediately started speaking about the whole complex brain. But my idea is simpler than that. Not necessarily that you need this complex brain, but that there is this space of potential that's open. The drive is a force, and a force, if it's a mechanical system, will push the thing towards a particular outcome. What the global workspace or what consciousness does is it creates a space in between, a space between the drive that pushes and the final action. And there is uncertainty, there is potential, there is a range of options. So it is this range that I call the local field. The local field is a range of possible movements to react on the drive, on the tension. And that is where the moment is where in the global workspace, at some moment, the decision is made to choose one of these possibilities. So that's the difference between the amoeba that feels the force and immediately moves, and the human that feels the force and then takes the time to reflect, not necessarily consciously, but to consider a range of options. It's in that freedom that I think is the essence of the field that I want to add.
Ima, are you there?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
You have
perfect.
some replies to these presentations?
Yes, first of all, I want to just thank everyone. I really felt very inspired. I think the two last presentation of Michael and also Jamie were really relevant. I just want to say that the notion of when I said consciousness knowing together, I love very much the idea of empathic thinking, but I wasn't specifically meaning empathic thinking. But it's a very nice addition. I have to reflect on that. I mainly wanted to say consciousness as knowing together to kind of tackle this hard problem of consciousness, meaning that, well, basically the notion of consciousness in itself, there is this, it has this inherent softness, which I think suggests that a hard solution cannot be the solution or a way to understand it.
Einer?
Yes, I would like to say thank you, even when on the way. This was really one of the best Zoom sessions I had for years.
Oh,
and
thank
it
you.
really connected me not only to Morris and Francis, but I want to refer to Jamie. Have you heard about Anthony Judge in Brussels? We worked on spatial metaphors for user interface design. How to take the metaphors from the meso to the macro and combine it what Doxiadis or Buckminster Fuller were looking into embodied schemas to connect. So anyway, this is my cognitive panorama. I was so happy to meet all the people I know in person or from afar. And thank you for Jason.
Oh, you're all welcome. Peter, you're an expert on consciousness.
Hi. I just have a couple of basic points. First, I'd like to just point out, I put it in the chat, there's a really excellent review of field theories of consciousness by Sue Pocket in Scholarpedia. So if you go to Scholarpedia and type in field theories of consciousness, you'll find that. The second is that I think one of the main weaknesses of field theories, as I have heard them lately, and actually going back to John's theory, is their connection with neural processes. I didn't hear any of that in Yolis's presentation. And it's almost as if, there's no linkage to the brain and what's going on in the brain, which we know is essential for conscious awareness, at least. So I'd like to make some suggestions. The notion of a field theory as a coherent sort of set of relations and processes, I think, is a good one. It can be linked to neural workspace theories if you focus on not quantum fields, which don't seem to have much physiological support, but if you focus on coherent patterns of neuronal activity and regeneration of neuronal signals, however they're encoded. So I would recommend that people thinking about field theories try to connect it to neuronal activity that we know is, under anesthesia, you don't have awareness, and under in the non-anesthetized waking state, you do. So there are differences in neuronal activity. And however you think about the ultimate reasons for or nature of consciousness, it has to be connected to concrete brain processes. So the Roy John, so the theory that comes closest to trying to do that is I think, in my opinion, is Roy John's field theory of consciousness, which was published in Consciousness and Cognition in 2001, and that's in the chat. So I would say, look at that. He tries to relate the electromagnetic fields to electrical and magnetic fields that are generated by neuronal activity. And there's been a discussion of what's called emphatic or volume conduction in the brain that could set those things up. The Gestaltist, Kuhler, proposed such things I think in the 40s and 50s. But Sperry carried out experiments where they put tantalum pieces of metal in brains and found that they did not disrupt visual perception, this is in animals, in the manner that would be expected if vision were reliant on fields. However, those metal pieces don't necessarily disrupt axonal transmission. So if there's coherence in the neural activity, spiking neural activity as transmitted through axons, that kind of coherence might survive these kinds of manipulations. So that's really all I have to say. Also, a minor question was, it seemed that Yolis was implying that there's extrasensory perception and brain-brain communication without neuronal processing. I didn't understand what he was talking about, so maybe that clarification could be made.
Peter, I have a follow-up little point to ask your opinion. What do you think about the hypothesis by von Neumann about that consciousness interacting with the quantum behavior?
I don't know of that. Where did von Neumann propose that?
Well, okay. So I will send you some link about that, because there is a controversial debate on that in the quantum physics. people want to struggle about the issue of the clash of the wave function, and there are different explanations. Copenhagen one as the dominating one, which Einstein did not approve, and there are about 3 or 4. But the last one is von Neumann, says that, well, he hypothesizes that the wave function collapse is purely because human consciousness. So that was area.
My reading of von Neumann on the measurement problem is not that, but I have to go back and look at it. I read him as an operationalist, very much in league with Bohr, in the Copenhagen interpretation. I think the person to look to for quantum linkages with neural activity, I think, is Stuart Hameroff, who's tried to link those things to the biophysics of neurons and the microtubular structure of neurons. I don't think so. The problem with these kinds of theories getting off the ground is this neuronal linkage, and whether you can have quantum fields at physiological temperatures, quantum coherence at physiological temperatures. So most neuroscientists, both in general neuroscience and in the consciousness studies neuroscience arena, are highly skeptical of that. So that's the big barrier, I think, to more general acceptance of those, or consideration of those sorts of theories.
Thank you. Jamie raised the hand.
Yes, just 2 quick comments. To Peter, the Gestalt psychology that you reference, that is Köhler, Kofna, Wertheimer, they had a materialistic model of Gestalt psychology, but the way that I'm using the term together with Klaus von Krippendorf, it's really, think of it from the angle of making distinctions and switching from one schema of distinctions to another. And so I'm not making any materialistic assumptions. So if someone would like to add them, that is fine. So it's a different way of thinking about the Gestalt switch. I just wanted to alert you to the difference. So it could be consistent. So it would be designing experiments to try to measure a Gestalt switch, but not in the manner that dus the earlier Gestalt switch psychologists did it. It would be in completely a novel way. So I just want to clarify that. And then Jason, with regards to von Neumann and the quantum, the wave collapse, so there are distinctions here. And as I study that literature, you have the instrument, you have the mathematical equations that were built to create, that were used to create the instrument. Then you have the actual experiment that produce data. And then you have a group of physicists that are standing around it and that have to decide how to make sense of those data. And when I listen to Francis, I see him making exactly the same distinctions, that he say, I'm giving you a model and there is a material reality. And in this material reality, there is an important phenomena, that is a subjective experience. And the objective of my model is to try to understand and do something with that subjective experience instead of just trivializing it. And so there is no, so he's talking, if I may, and Francis, tell me if it's wrong. So you're talking the subjective experience of the physicist who in the moment are looking at the experimental data coming out of the accelerators, and I have to decide what do they mean.
Morris, Peter asked you for clarification.
Hi, Peter. Thank you. You know, we had 20 minutes. We have 7 slides. You're right. Neural activity is very important with respect to mental processes. You need a physical component to have, as far as I'm aware, a metaphysical one. They're connected. I don't know whether you can have metaphysical without physical, but the implication is that one requires the other. If you want to look at the relationship between what I've discussed and neuronal activity, I recommend that you look at my 2022 paper, which is, if you get the slides, it's at the bottom. It's only in 6-point because there were so many references, I couldn't get them all into one slide, and I didn't present them. I blocked them out, but they're there at the bottom. And it discusses.
Why don't you just list the title and where it's published for the record?
It's in the slides.
Just say it on the video, so it will be on the video.
Yeah, let me see if I can find it. Share.
Okay, consciousness, sapience.
I put it into the chat.
Meta-cybernetic view in systems. 10/6/254 page. Okay.
This is the one. Oh no, that's not it. Consciousness, sapience, and sentience. You can find that if you just type my name in and put that title in, it'll come up straight away on the browser. Is that enough?
Yeah. Just so it's in the video, so someone watching this can access it.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. But yes, overall, it is important to consider that. In the paper, I also consider quantum aspects, and with respect to having the possibility of communication without physical processes, there are quantum explanations for that. For instance, the ability for entanglement and so forth. It's not something I want to go into, but I do discuss that very briefly in the paper.
So are you saying that quantum processes are not physical processes?
Well, they are. They underpin physical processes. First of all, quantum processes are all probabilistic. So in fact, in the presentation I made, when I talked about an information field, that fits in with quantum explanations, because then we can talk about probabilities. Now, I use Roy Frieden's work. It's an information theory, which is probabilistic. And from that, you can get intrinsic information from the environment, and you can become efficacious in the way in which autopoiesis works. So if you're talking about the possibility of a living system being stable, that means it requires processes, autopoiesis, to be efficacious. That therefore requires the appropriate level of correct information. If you've got incorrect information, then you have problems in. For instance, an organism adapts, it can adapt incorrectly. I discussed the same process in a paper I wrote in 2021 when I talked about viruses as living systems, because there's a debate now as to whether or not viruses are living. And I discussed that in very great detail. So that may be another paper that you might want to look at. If you just type in my name and put in viruses as living systems, it should come up.
So about telepathy, what is your position on that?
To be honest, I suspect it's feasible, but I haven't really studied it. One doesn't really know whether or not. Look, there were lots of experiments that were done early on during Cold War period by the US military in order to try and get Russian secrets, etc. And a lot of those people advocate that telepathy is possible and related phenomena. I haven't experienced it myself, so I can't give you first-hand knowledge. But theoretically, if one using quantum phenomena as the basis for neural processing, then I suspect that one could make an argument that it is feasible.
Larry?
For instance, sorry, the reference I put in my slides where there is brain-to-brain communication, I believe that was an experiment that was done with dogs. And they looked at responses and they found in some way or other that there was in fact a communication process going on, but there were no physical processes that could be observed. So
that's referenced in the 2022 paper?
No, that's referenced. No, I didn't. There are a lot of references in these slides that were not in the 2022 paper. And if you look at the slides, it's in there. You'll find it in the last slide, which I didn't show you because I'm only allowed 7 slides, so I blocked them off. Thank you,
Larry
Jason.
wants to say something. Next is Francis.
About telepathy, I am personally very skeptical about it. And these experiments that the CIA did, yes, they did them and they abandoned them because it was simply not producing anything useful. And that's a general pattern. Telepathy experiments have been done since 1880 or about there. For 150 years. People have been doing lots and lots of experiments in all possible ways for all kinds of parapsychology. That's in very serious universities, including Princeton and Stanford, and the result is still about 0. They find some tiny significant changes in certain experiments, but then if somebody else does that experiment again, they don't find anything. So it looks like a statistical artifact. And then my other reason why I'm skeptical about it is, if telepathy would exist, then why do we need all this extremely complicated machinery of hearing and seeing and brain processes, doing transforming and processing all these physical inputs? If we could just, why would we need all that, these complicated ways of having to learn to speak and to listen and to see? And it just doesn't make sense. If that would exist, that we wouldn't be using it and seeing it being used and seeing other creatures using it. If that property would exist, it would be so useful that somebody somewhere would be using it practically, and I don't see that happening.
Larry.
Yeah, first, thank you to all the presenters. It's very, very interesting. A few observations. When we use the word consciousness or self-consciousness, it seems we may be, you, me, whoever, talking about different things at different times. And in that context, I appreciate Michael's slide where you had 3, I call them 3 types of consciousness. And personally, I don't have a whole lot of interest in amoebas or even dogs here. It's really the third type of consciousness in your chart, Michael, that is of interest. Self-consciousness, the awareness, our awareness of our mind in and of itself. And in that slide, you relegate that to metaphysics. I don't have a particular interest in metaphysics, but I am interested in that kind of consciousness. And that's where I think some of the contributions of cybernetics can be quite useful. For example, in the first 2 presentations, Maurice and Michael, I didn't hear the word language used at all, or languaging. Yet, if you want to talk about consciousness from the Maturana or Varela point of view, you have to talk about language. consciousness arises as recursions in language. And Jamie did, by bringing in the idea of metaphor, begin going down that track. I think another consequence is that, and this was in Maurice's presentation, that rather than affect and cognition being two completely separate things with causal relation between them, it might be better to think of them as intertwined. Talk about them as phenomenon that we look at differently, but as maybe two sides of the same coin almost. And maybe that's where the idea of tension comes in. There's a tension between them, but it's not a causal relation. They go together. Can't have one without the other. So those are just some observations. I guess just to conclude, I'd like to see the idea of language and languaging in particular be used more in these conversations. Thanks.
Igor, you want to say something?
Hello, guys and girls. I did not want to raise my hand because I wanted to play the observer's game, observing the observer, and basically trying to exploit, sorry to do that, exploiting your reasoning process. Why is that? Because I tried to answer myself the questions I wanted to put to you. And the first one is about the motivation. And this is what I wanted to ask Michael. Basically, what motivates the brain actually to do their job? Why are they thinking? And I'll try to use this particular session to answer it from myself, because I have an external motivation. The situation which I'm trying to deal with, it's rather complicated, because you're most of all talking about thinking as a part of physical human brain activities. But in humankind, it's not like that. We have our own thinking, but we also have external thinking, which we exploit. That's basically how the society works. But up to now, the external thinking was either compiled by single individuals or group individuals. And we were hoping that the processes will become clearer, where we have some machines doing the job, and we could elaborate what they are doing. Well, this did not happen because nobody understands what machines are doing, where they think. And I'm relating to artificial intelligence here. So we have this problem of basically externalizing or internalizing thinking processes. And if we call learning something, we exercise on, basically exercise on thinking, that can only happen with, and this is a speculation, that can only happen if we actually do the internal thinking. If we just exploit external thinking, the learning process is just something that, looks like getting the results with no work being done. And I basically that's my motivation to figure out how to govern or how to explain the relationship between internal thinking and external thinking, especially with the artificial intelligence doing some of the external thinking, right? And I had a question for Maurice about the diagram where I did not see the actuators, but I will pass that. But I would go to Jamie about thinking together. You mentioned thinking together and said this is empathic thinking, right? I wouldn't say that. I would say that it's exploiting somebody external capacity to think, right? So that you don't need to use your own resources to think by yourself. So
Okay.
it's not.
Yeah,
So basically, I'm challenging all of you. Just open the discussion and yes.
But
Thank
I
you.
wanted to point out consciousness as a distinction-making process. So I make distinctions, you make distinctions, you're experimenting with
But we make also relations, not only distinctions.
Yeah, no, but I start with the distinctions and
okay.
And dus every human being. And then, as you say, there is a relational component, but now there's two ways to think of relations. One is as a mathematical entity, algebra, and the other one is the object relations branch in psychoanalysis. That's the baby coming in existence on the vibrations of the body of the mother and then being separated and at birth and then put in her arms or put in a cot and separated forever. So I'm just trying to point out by making distinctions the difference between a model and reality. And I picked up on empathic thinking because of certain things that Shima said. So I'm not identifying thinking together with empathic thinking, but I'm trying to point out to a phenomena in psychology that we project our own thinking on someone else and we actually never listen to the person. And so we think we know exactly what someone else is thinking, but it's just our own mind projected on the other person. And this empathic thinking is to do an effort to not do that. But it may not be successful, it may be completely fail. But at least I have now a word that I can say, are I projecting my thought processes or are I actually listening? And I think that is a very important dimension if one wants to talk about awareness. It's not just awareness of the self, but also of the other human being or the other sentient being. And what I heard you, if I may, and then I'll stop, when you say external and internal thinking, you're projecting an anthropology. You anthropomorphize a machine. What is a machine? Is just electrons jumping up and down orbitals. If you think of electrons as material entities, or if you think of it as waves, then you will say it in a slightly different way. But it is just my dishwasher to which I tacked something on so that whenever I wash dishes, I can have a conversation with them. That is artificial intelligence. So I start by setting it up. It's a semiconductor. There is a semiconductor device that we do things with. And now, how are we going to explain what that semiconductor device is doing?
Okay. Yes, I was not relating only to artificial intelligence. Basically, I was using you as an experiment to do the external thinking for me. So it's
okay. Fair enough.
Yes. Yeah. So it's not. It doesn't have to be AI. It can, basically, this is how we built our society.
Yeah. Okay. So then I explicitly just make a distinction between because everyone is talking about ChatGPT. That's why I thought maybe you were making an allusion there. But it's really a human being that we think together. And now how do I divide a human being? Well, that is when two people can have intercourse and produce viable grandchildren. So all the people that can have intercourse with one another and produce viable grandchildren, so it's not sterile, they're mixing their genes, and I have a boundary around it. So it's not some infinity type of concept of thinking, but it's very specifically related to a certain biological species that we call human. Yeah.
Jerome, show us what you were painting. Yeah, go ahead.
You want to see? Ah, you've been watching.
Yeah, why not? We have been watching you.
I'm listening. Wait a minute. Can you see? I have to back. It's a very large painting. Can you see it?
It's it's a picture, or you are doing? Oh yeah.
It's an African sunset.
Oh, okay.
I took yes. Anyway, so I'm working on the sun, but
So we're talking about the consciousness. You are doing consciousness.
Yeah, I was listening to this last exchange between Ivan and Margareta. Very interesting. I think you have to discuss and define the word exploitation, which of course has many different connotations in modern society. Of course, one of them very much influenced through, for instance, Karl Marx and this philosophy of class warfare. But if you go back to the origins of the word exploit, it just means to use, to utilize. Humans exploit nature's resources and so on. So I was thinking about Peter Berger, Austrian sociologist of religion, and in his book, The Sacred Canopy, which I think is from 1967, he actually defines religion as in a way, as a resource to be exploited. I was just thinking about this as a metaphor, and he even compares religion to going to the store to buy clothes. You didn't design the clothes, you didn't fashion them yourself. But there are many people in the world, billions of them, in fact, who ascribe to Christianity or Islam or any of these other religions that are out there. Or science, you could even see as a religion. But so in fact, we all exploit, so to speak, the products of others, to somehow manifest or do consciousness in our everyday lives. And then you could talk about the interchange between the exploited and the exploiting, so to speak. And maybe, in fact, there are religious doctrines that are exploiting those who, believe to be doing the exploiting. So I think that there could be quite a dialectical relationship there, and it's not the idea. So I think it depends on how you define exploitation. So that's my observation.
Gerard, are you going to give us some disagreement? We're waiting.
Yes, Gerard.
Yeah, he's trying to unmute.
As I was watching Jerome do his painting, there it occurred to me that what I'm observing is the kind of consciousness I'm interested in. He's doing something there. He's made a conscious decision to put his camera so that we are watching him do it. And he's doing something that I've never seen any other animal do.
Yeah, Gerard, go ahead, please.
Well, the topic is a little bit too wide for me, so I have only one question, actually. Maurice Jolis, he identified a number of interacting parts. And so, in a sense, the whole can be seen as a theory. What I was wondering about is whether any of these concepts actually allows us to introduce a metric on the phenomena so that they become measurable.
What I did with, I've written a number of papers with Roy Frieden, who's a physicist and works in optics. and he invented a theory, an information theory, which I came across in 1998 when he published his first book on it. He published a second book on it in 2004, and I integrated that into my own work. And that uses probability distributions in order to identify phenomena that we can perceive, and do so as efficiently as possible to get the maximum information out of the environment that we can. I then used the same approach in order to create metrics potentially for metaphysical processes, explaining in a paper, I don't remember which paper. There was another paper I published in 2021, which underlies the theory, the theory of cybernetics that I'm propounding, which came originally from Eric Schwartz, but which I have elaborated on to quite a large extent. And that shows how you can create metrics in order to look at autopoietic processes by setting up, if you want, maps from which you can collect information and then transmit that information. So that basically, I've not actually made any calculations, but in theory, in principle, it should be possible to create metrics and use those metrics to identify conscious processes. There is a theory, is it IIT it's called? I can't recall. I have referred to that in one of my papers in 22 or 21, I can't recall now, which talks about being able to predict conscious states, but it's not something that I'm very familiar with. And there's so many criticisms of the theory that I haven't really taken it too seriously. I hope that helps. It's a halfway house, if you want.
Igor.
Well, it clarifies my doubts about the possibility of measurement in these areas, because whenever you measure, even if you use probability measures, you have to be able to identify what it is that you are taking as your input. And that's extremely, Larry Richards, in fact, pointed it out. Whatever you want to observe may change under the process of observing.
Well, that's true. That is true. But you can only take one time slot at a moment. If you, if I freeze everything in time and take an observation, then I deal with that observation. I can take measurements from that, and then I can, if I want to find out if there's a change, I take another measurement. That's the basically one uses parameters within probability distributions in order to undertake that process.
Okay, it requires more discussion, but thank you.
Okay, let's maybe Jacob will in advance answer my question, but yes, let's hope so. You know, if we think about cognition and thinking as a process, and we put external and internal thinking in there. So should there be, and I adopt that, should there be different protocols for thinking internally and externally? So basically exchanging the ideas, you know, doing some external resource, using some external resources to think, and then coming back to your own mind and think by yourself, and then reply and do that basically, or multi-log if you want, with the externality. So basically, can external thinking be thought as thinking, as reasoning? And if we go down back one step down, the processes, the protocols of thinking, do you think they differ? Are they practically the same but delayed? I don't know. Maybe if Jacob could.
Michael?
Yeah, so this is Igor. I want to go back to the first question, excuse me, that you asked, which was what motivates brain thinking. And actually, there's maybe some just first off the word. Are we using thinking and cognition synonymously here? I'm not sure I necessarily would, but we could set that conversation aside. But it brings to mind an analogy. This doesn't answer your question, but about why I don't like the word thinking in this context, which is that thoughts are to the brain like sweat is to the body. I feel like we just emit them. That's just what certain brain processes do, is to generate thoughts. Whether, I don't know how important the thoughts actually are.
I'm talking about the process, and you're talking about the state.
No, I'm talking about the process, I think. But let's but you wanted to know about motivation, right? And I think this touches on Larry's disinterest in amoebas. And so I share that. That's sort of how I started and why I went into neuroscience. I wasn't interested in becoming a bacteriologist, or nonetheless, we clearly evolved from these organisms. And so there's going to be the origins of the nervous system are found in single-celled creatures, even though they don't have a nervous system, the sort of molecular setup for all of that. So I think we should include them. What I would suggest is, and I didn't have time to mention this into my in my presentation, but that these are nested processes, so that the sort of primitive, if you will, pain-pleasure distinction that's present in unicellular organisms is present in us, as is a higher order distinction that might be more socially mediated. For example, shame, pride, right? These are much higher order emotional state that I think is necessary to understand language and emotionality. And I just see there that it was Peter put in the concept that empathy comes prior to language, whether it's prior to or co-evolving with. There's a whole line of research right around the early primatology that the sort of social, both the ability to be social and communicate and actually eat protein and have fires and sit around a fire and have a conversation and have nutrient-dense material. All of this, I think, is in the same pot. I don't have a clear story to weave out of that, but I think it's all in the same mix. Igor, I don't know that entirely answers your question about, but there was another question there about the external, internal. I would point to Terry Deacon's work on offloading, that there is no such thing as just purely internal. I don't think there is any purely internal process. We're always a species in a community. I don't think there's ever been an example of a singular species made of one individual, one organism, although some might argue Gaia or something like this. But so I think we're always exploiting, to use however you want to use that word, but there's some degree of external process, and would agree with what Jamie was saying about that you might want to be aware of whether you're using what I think she was referring to as projective identification, where you're seeing the mind of somebody else and assuming that it's your own, that it's their thoughts, you're just projecting your own thoughts onto them, versus this idea of empathic communication, where I wonder, Jamie, if the self-other boundary there, the distinction starts to blur. And that to me is sort of a key aspect of empathy. Well, anyway, that was a jumbled dump of a lot of ideas, but
Michael, what you just said is worth another session. That layer by layer build up. The bottom, the amoeba type of very simple mechanism, and all the way up to the emergence of language and the emergence of metaphors, and all the way. So So would you be interested to give us another presentation about that? Because we are going to have the third session for this, where Jerry, Chandler, and myself will do some presentation, or maybe you can bring that structure to us so, to clarify. I think a lot of us will enjoy that. Can you do that?
Yeah, I should be able to do that.
Great. Jamie, go ahead.
Yes, this my reply. So this yes, projective identification. I was referencing to that entire literature, and I think it should be included in the curriculum so that everyone becomes familiar with that language. But now the distinction between the self and other, I discovered this philosopher, and thanks to George Spencer Brown, whom I didn't know existed until I heard Luke Kaufman talking about it, I started really thinking about the act of making a distinction. And essential that act is to the civilizing process, and how the act involves the drawing of a graphic scratch or symbol or whatever. And so I want to point out that Terry Deacon, in his book on the symbolic species, doesn't at all address the significance of the event that 100,000 years ago, primates, or whatever you want to call them, Homo sapiens, a group of them started using a sign to signify whatever they decided it to signify. And so that they just used a graphic symbol for the purpose of abstract thinking. So does that graphic symbol, that languaging, that Larry referenced, I think the word languaging is maybe still too vague. It's like literally the writing and the reading. And I think Emmanuel Levinas is a philosopher, a student of Husserl, who points that out. We, thanks to the computational machine metaphor, we think that we're all variations of the same ideal blueprint, and so that there's a blurry between self and other. But no, we're all unique. And the interesting thing is that distinction-making process that helped us think abstractly and work together. So the existence of the written word is evidence for a cooperative, that we are a cooperative species, because otherwise we would never agreed on how to use scratches on paper to develop an alphabet, and after that mathematics and logic. So that distinction between self and other, I think, is fundamentally important, and that's precisely the limitation of the machine metaphor, is that it says, you don't need to worry about it, it's not important. And then people become frustrated because no one is listening to them, because we already think we know what they're saying. And so that's why I got interested in empathy, because really the emphasis is on, I try to listen to what you are saying as a unique being, different from me, and it's very hard. And I think it requires practice, and that is the reason we are what we are today, is because at key times in the history, people were listening, and for some reason that listening is not fully appreciated. And then in response to Igor, I want to point out, I think the internal versus external thinking are very different, in that the internal thinking I do privately by myself, and the external thinking is in the presence of others, where there are rituals involved, and these rituals need to be agreed just by all the participants, and they can violate them if they want, but then the group needs to decide on how to deal with those violations. So it's more like a public type of thinking that involves graphic symbols, while the internal thinking can be however one decides to do that internal thinking.
You're wrong.
Yes, in this discussion just now ongoing between Jamie and Michael, I guess, meeting for the first time. I found this very interesting, coming from an economics background, although of course now I've revealed myself as a painter as well. I also studied art anyway, but it's very interesting if you look at the history of economics, how what a prominent place Adam Smith has in the discipline, and in particular his work, The Wealth of Nations, written published in 1776. And of course now of late there has been a resurgence of interest in his other major work, which was published almost 30 years earlier, or I guess 1758, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, where the main idea that Smith is developing in this book is not the idea that people act through self-interest and through everyone's collective self-interest or aggregate self-interest, the best outcome arises, but in fact, as if by an invisible hand, but which he only uses one time, but the principle that he calls sympathy, which undergirds all of his thinking, basically, in this former book. And now there's a growing number of economists who are suggesting it was a mistake to divorce the one book from the other. And in fact, it is only through this principle of sympathy, of consideration for others, that some element of self-interest, as Smith was interpreting it, allowed civilization, so to speak, to exist. And I think that it's a very interesting topic, of course, seen from a neurological, or primatologists, of course, have also studied sympathy or empathy in primates, and we do see that in many regards. There's reciprocity. If you pick the lice from my back, I will do the same for you. And so I think that I would also be interested in this second discussion. Jason, by the way, if you need another discussant or someone to present, so I could talk from the economic sort of perspective.
Claudia.
I think I don't have much to contribute, but maybe a question to Jamie about, I was wondering, I came recently across this response by Varela to the heart problem, and I wondered whether you know there's an edited collection, I think it's Shear, and I thought there might be some similarities actually between your position and Varela's response to the heart problem. Are you aware of that?
No, and so I would love the reference.
I can send.
Yeah, because there is in management a group of people who, of course, you know that, everyone knows that, sorry. This is the autopoietic reasoning, but there is also this controversy about how to apply to social systems. So I'm definitely interested.
Yes, I'm going to send them.
Claudia, you're from China, right? You are currently in China. What
Yes.
are the Chinese colleagues in AI field talking about this consciousness issue?
I think I don't know anyone here who talks about consciousness. I was.
They avoid completely.
But as far as I know, I would need to look into this. I don't know whether you know a little bit about the history of cybernetics in China, because there was one very important person who kind of was expelled from the US and then came to China and kind of. Yeah.
He was my uncle.
Okay. So I think there are links to this idea of consciousness in his version of cybernetics. Is that correct?
He wrote engineering cybernetics, basically automatically control rocket science.
But there is another kind of engagement of his, if I'm right, in that goes into Chinese traditional medicine and all that.
That was in his later years. He's sort of deeply become a believer of Qigong and strange phenomena. and brain-to-brain telepathy that Peter asked. He was, because he was a semi-god kind of figure, so he got a tremendous freedom of speaking whatever comes into his mind. But I had a video done at ISSS request. A number of previous ISSS presidents, they all received a magazine insert, not a magazine, but a magazine insert of science, claiming that, well, he was the father of system science. So a lot of people, they ask me, what's going on? Well, how come we suddenly have a Chinese father for system science? So I made a presentation introducing my interaction with this particular figure during my college years, and I can send you that link, and I had some observation about this very strange and controversial figure.
That would be very interesting.
Answer your question.
Yes, I would be very interested in that. Excellent.
Okay, we beyond. Who else has more questions and comments? No? We have a new friend from Pahang. You want to say something?
Yeah, I guess my question would be for Francis and Shima regarding I read a draft of their paper regarding philosophical zombies and primitive organisms. I was wondering, what's the evidence for, this raw feeling being different between humans and other organisms like a chimpanzee? Is there any evidence that there's a lack of qualia in other organisms besides humans?
Francis. He was talking on the phone. Francis, are you with us?
Looks like he may be on the phone. Parham, I would. There, go ahead.
I was on the phone, but can you repeat it?
Sure. So it's about that the notion of primitive organisms and what you call philosophical zombies. I was wondering if there's any evidence that other organisms besides humans kind of lack that raw feeling or qualia, or what makes you believe that humans suddenly achieve this raw feeling as opposed to other organisms?
No, I would distinguish 3 levels of what you might call sensation. At the simplest level, we wouldn't call it sensation. That is the mechanical ID, like I hit a billiard ball with a cue. The billiard ball reacts by starting to move. We wouldn't say that the billiard ball has felt the impulse of the cue. It has felt it in a purely mechanical sense, that the momentum of the cue is passed on. Also, the ball starts rolling, but internally nothing has changed with the billiard ball. Now take an amoeba or a bacterium and give it some impulse, like give it some, hook it with something small, and it will feel it in the sense that it will disturb its autopoiesis. The processes inside the organism will be affected by that. So it's not just the outside object that will move because of the impulse. Inside something will change. So there is sensation there at the level of a disturbance out of the autopoietic organization, but the reaction to that will be kind of deterministic. Well, if you then go to the human level and probably the level of higher animals, probably at least monkeys and probably most mammals and maybe birds will be in that, where there is something like a global workspace, what happens there is that the signal of the sensation is kept active inside the neural network for a while. There is a circulating pattern of activation, and the fact that it circulates means that it kept in working memory, means that it has the time to affect and be affected by other parts of the brain. So that is for me where consciousness in the normals, in the common sense arises. It is the fact that the pattern of activation circulates that allows it to interact with other parts of the brain, with other inputs. And that is where then finally the decision is made to act in this way or to act in that way or not to act at all. That's where the range of possibilities arises. Well, with the bacterium, there is not this kind of working memory where things are kind of provisionally kept so as to allow other cognitive processes to interfere with it, to interact with it.
Mm-hmm. And is this also related to tension? Do you think there's increased tension as a result of these kind of scaffolding of interactions, as you're describing it?
Not necessarily increased tension, but there are different tensions that are kept in different. I mean, suppose that I'm sitting here in my chair. Most of the tension at this moment comes from the sounds I hear. Some of it will come from the faces I see, but some of it may come from maybe I have some pain in my back, or maybe something is pushing against my toes. So there are all kinds of different tensions which my body senses at the moment, and my consciousness out of all these tensions decides the most important one is the words that I hear and to which now I'm replying. But these others potentially, maybe at a certain moment I see somebody on the screen making a face, and that may make me think that that person disagrees with what I say. Maybe suddenly that disagreement now becomes a tension that I then react to, and I change what I'm saying because I saw that reaction. Or maybe, let's say that a wasp has entered my office and I'm stung by the wasp. I'm not at all expecting that. And suddenly I say, "Aye, what's going on here?" So then there is a new tension that came from somewhere completely different, but that has become strong enough to change my consciousness so that instead of being conscious of what I was going to say next, I'm suddenly conscious of this pain, of this wasp sting. So in that sense, the tension, there is this field of tensions out of which the consciousness then chooses to select one of the possible reactions to. So that is where the freedom is, the fact that there is this range of possibilities and that consciousness gives each of those the opportunity to attract the attention, but most of them it dismisses.
Got it. And it's not all about memory, right? Because I mentioned kind of higher organisms have this kind of sustained consciousness temporally, right? Because I mean, I've read papers where, for example, slime mold, they have memory. Like after months, they remember things. If that evidence becomes stronger, would that have any weight on that argument? That what you're describing, or memory is kind of different than the process you're describing?
No, I'm distinguishing between working memory and what we usually call memory. What we call memory is something that stays there for a long time. Working memory is what is going on in your mind at this moment. And that's a memory which typically lasts a couple of seconds and then it changes into something else. The working memory is what you use if, for example, if I formulate my sentences, I need to keep at least a few words in my working memory before I can say them. But my working memory does not remember what I said 5 minutes ago, but it remembers what I said 5 seconds ago. So the working memory is something very temporary, but it's enough to allow different tensions coming from different sources to interact with each other, and then kind of collectively the decision is made that this one is the most important one and that is the action I will perform.
Okay. Thank you.
This is great. We are actually doing Macy meetings. Thank you so much. Any more comments? No? No? Okay. See you next time. We shall have a third session for this same topic.